Back in the day, farming certainly seemed less complicated, and I'm not just talking about technology. Today, there are complex issues that demand careful consideration. Issues like the use of GMOs. We started that conversation last week. Part 2 of that discussion is coming up next on Our Ohio.
This program is made possible thanks to the generous support from the Ohio Farm Bureau members, producing our food, growing our economy, and making communities stronger. The Ohio Farm Bureau, forging a partnership between farmers and consumers. And by
Nationwide's family of companies has a variety of products to protect your family, with our promise to be there when you need us, from city to farm. Nationwide is on your side.
Funding for Our Ohio is also made possible by the generous support from Turner Farm, a working organic farm and education center in Indian Hill, Ohio. And by your membership support to this public television station. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dave Russell. Today we're talking GMOs. Joining us is Janice Person, Online Engagement Director at Monsanto Company, Alan Armstrong, a Clark County grain farmer, Richard Stewart of Carriage House Farm, and Amalie Lipstrew, Policy Program Coordinator with the Ohio Ecological Food and Farm Association. I find it interesting that here early in this discussion that both of our farmers have talked about raising both GMO and non-GMO. It just depends on what's going to work best for that particular year, maybe. So are farmers in Ohio atypical when it comes to growing GMO or non-GMO?
I think we're the same anywhere in the United States, because even though you may not have GMO, you do have chemical crops, and there's chemical farmers and non-chemical farmers and farmers in between, and I think the state of Ohio is just as diversified in how we farm.
That's why we need more and more tools in the toolbox, and you can selectively choose out which ones work and have a diversity of tools instead of relying just on one thing. For me, even if I have a headache, if every time I have a headache I have Advil, over time, Advil's not as effective. So what we're encouraging farmers to do is use a variety of tools, and we actually have some programs in place to really incentivize that kind of behavior on the farm, whether it's herbicides or insecticides. We take that product stewardship really, it's something we hold near and dear to our hearts, and we talk about it a lot with not only with farmers, but with the EPA and others about what can we do to be better stewards of our land, our crops, and the products that we as a company produce.
Well, and I think that it is good to have a lot of tools in the toolbox. And certainly our organic and sustainable farmers have a tremendous amount of tools. I don't think that, we have to rely on increased chemical usage and increased chemical combinations. I think that, there are additional alternatives to that, and we need to look at some of those other options as well.
You're right. Genetically modified plants has allowed us to use less chemical today than we did. And I'm familiar with the report that you're referring to, and I'd also ask you to go back about 10 or 15 years ago on the ALS resistant weeds that we had. And then you can go back a little further than that, and then you'll find another site. And so that is what makes it necessary for us to continue to evolve and come up with different and better and get better at what we do. The ground that we farm, because of the terrain, tillage, we haven't tilled for 22 years. And I cringe at the thought of disturbing that soil and tilling it at all. Because I don't like black snow. I mean, if you remember back in the day, if you drive out across the country where guys moldboard plow, I did it, we've all done it, and you get the wind and then you see that snow turn black. Well, what was that? Well, that's the soil.
Mm-hmm.
So everything that was adhered to that soil moved with that when the snow melt, on down the river to the Gulf of Mexico from my area. Okay, I take that. I mean, that's huge to me. I don't want to lose any of my topsoil, and I don't want to lose any of the things that I put on there. And without these technologies, I would have to go back to that, and I think that's a huge step backwards.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that you've been able to reduce the herbicide use on your farm. That's not what the national statistics are showing us. Actually, the studies are showing that since these GE crops have been introduced, the use of herbicides has actually increased. And I do think it's important to point out that, we do want to have tools in the toolbox and we want to be responsible, but a lot of these products are made by corporations whose first loyalty is to generate value for their shareholders. So, that I think is why we need to think very broadly about tools that are not just chemically oriented tools.
So, when it comes to the general public, the consumer, do you feel like they're well informed, or do they need more information?
Well, I think when it comes to, the science of they would like to see more science, and they would like to see more transparency in labeling. And I know that, people may disagree about safety and disagree about the chemical usage, but I think from a consumer perspective, they just are saying that they want the right to know. And I think from that perspective, it's important to, give the public that information, let them know if products contain genetically engineered ingredients, and again, if it's safe for the table, put it on the label.
I think safety and labeling is so critical. I know for me personally, I found I've been eating too many carbs. My family, we love our starches and things, right? And so having those labels on our products that we have confidence in, that we know it's providing us good information so we can have a safe, balanced diet and things, it truly is critical. I've found I need to eat more protein in the morning and had gotten away from that. I think that was probably pretty common for Americans as a realization. But what I think in terms of the labeling of GMOs, I think voluntary really gets us where we need to be, because the FDA that regulates sort of what those nutrition labels and things in the mandatory sense look like has found GMOs to be safe. And so I understand people wanting a choice, and I totally support that those choices are valid and for reasons I may not agree with, but I understand other people making other choices. So for that reason, I think a voluntary labeling system works. There are a lot of choices out in the marketplace today, but an added voluntary label would make a lot of sense too.
Alan, what about from a farmer's perspective on labeling?
And I guess I've got to agree, from a voluntary standpoint, I think it's great. Everybody has the right to know. There's no question in that. I mean, who would argue that? However, I believe that if the demand is there for something that's non-GMO, that the burden should be on, we'll label it as that, because nowhere in our food chain has there been any science that said there's a problem with genetically modified food. I haven't seen it. The FDA, nobody has. So by making it mandatory, it does two things. One, it makes people think, oh, there must be something wrong with it. And two, it adds unnecessarily to the cost to the consumer, because the consumer is who ultimately pays. So, but again, if we have friends that will only eat non-GMO, and I'm fine with that. I've got no problem with that. And if that's the choice you want to make, I don't know that we need to burden everybody else with the cost of doing that. I've been involved with a national or an international charity, and where we go in developing countries to try to improve the diet, help improve the diets of the children. And we do these things called feeding trials. When I first was involved, like, how can you even call it this? You know, it sounds like something we do with livestock, where half the families volunteer to allow their children to be fed the food that we're providing, which happens to be using soybean to improve their protein. And by the end, and we always do, the ones who didn't want their kids in there because they see the difference right away. You know, we're trying to improve the diet of people around the world, which an extra 25 cents, an extra dime is critical. And so, you know, I just don't see the need in it from that standpoint of the additional cost. It's perfectly fine to have it, but I don't think it needs to be mandated or required.
Well, I'm really glad you brought up that cost issue, because I think that sometimes people are scared into thinking that it's going to put their food out of reach, number one, by having these labels, which I don't think is accurate. And also, sometimes, you know, we're told that we have to embrace this technology because it will feed the world. And technically, we produce enough in terms of caloric intake to feed the world right now. But a lot of the problems that lead to hunger and malnutrition relate to poverty and problems with distribution systems. So, you know, since these GE crops have been introduced, we really haven't seen prices go down. So I think prices are really important, but you know, it's also important not to scare consumers that they're not going to be able to afford their food.
You know, you mentioned on food systems. I absolutely agree. There's been a lot of food waste. We as a country, we have problems with obesity. We have problems with food waste. I know when I leave my house and I'm traveling for a week, too often I've bought produce that I'm not going to eat, or I know it's going to go bad, so either I take it to the office and try and give it to somebody, or I throw it away, it's really a crime when you've got people really going hungry around the community that I'm in and around the world. I don't know that it's a justification for GMOs to, quote, feed the world. And I can understand why people would think, oh, maybe if you're worried about feeding everybody, you're not as worried about my individual health. But for me, what I've seen is the involvement of soybean and things like that. It is a low-cost protein, and it makes a big difference in people's lives. And if you go to a place like India or in places in Africa and stuff, you'll see where people are protein deficient. We also see a lot of food being wasted in those countries because it's not able to get to market, because there's not infrastructure for things along that line. GMOs are just one thing. They're not going to solve hunger on the planet. It's one tool, and we have to be reminded of that. It's not a silver bullet. We don't expect it to do everything, but we do expect it to be part of the solution. And part of the equation is now the growing population. By 2050, the population we're going to have in the world, in the U.S., is going to be making more demands on our food system than it's ever made before. And I think that there's a complex way of addressing that. And again, GMOs are a tiny part of that solution, but I think they're still an important part and not something we should eliminate without that kind of foresight.
Richard, you're farming here in maybe what we considered a more urban surrounding. Mm-hmm. Have you seen the attitudes of your neighbors change with the technology that's available?
I mean, our consumer culture is just as diverse as the farming culture. I mean, that's part of. I, as a farmer, talking to a lot of our other local farmers, and here in Hamilton County in northern Kentucky, southeastern Indiana, we actually have more farmers that are non-grain farmers than grain farmers, because we don't have large tracts of flat ground to till or to work. And we always talk about local versus non-local food consumption, and that the people that want to purchase local, we call them foodies or locavores, that represents about 6 or 7% of the population. And figure organic's a little bit larger than that, maybe 12, 13, 14, 15%. So we're always looking, saying, from a local standpoint, we want to educate so we get more people that want to buy locally. And 1% increase represents 3 or 4 new farmers being able to grow their farm business on a small scale. Mm-hmm. And the GMO, I think collectively in the United States, if you go to somebody and say, do you know what a GMO is? Most people don't know. I mean, even to this day and age, I mean, you and I were at a conference and we know what GMOs are because it's something we talk about all the time and how I want to increase the food culture here in Cincinnati so that Cincinnati as a region has its own food identity because we have things that are unique here that aren't grown in Nebraska or California or Maine. And the GMOs are just part of that kind of monoculture of food that I would like to get away from. So it's not even really an issue that's GMO, it's just corn, soybeans. There's other stuff out there that has higher protein. You know, grandfather used to grow up buckwheat, fantastic crop, does great soil conditioning, we grow it, it's non-GMO. Somebody will ask me if it's GMO. Well, of course it's not. You know, I go to Lowe's, am I allowed to mention it? I go to a big box store and they have rhubarb rootstock and asparagus rootstock and it's labeled non-GMO. Well, of course it's non-GMO because nobody makes a GMO version of that, but everything, and that's where I fall into this weird kind of gray area on the GMO on the GMO discussion is that part of me wants everything to be chemical free. I don't want fungicides. I don't mind ugly fruit, but at the same time, it's the people out there saying, well, it's non-GMO, so therefore it's automatically safe for me. It falls into a category of green as opposed to danger, and that's where I'd like that discussion to go towards. It's not, a GMO farmer isn't necessarily ruining their soils. We've got organic farmers in California that are planting 5 lettuce crops back to back all season long in the valley in Southern California using snow melt or pumping out an aquifer that's down 80 feet because they don't have enough water out there. Is that a sustainable form of agriculture, or is it better because it's non-GMO? And so when we talk about a population worrying about it, I think there's so many things that we're worrying about. The GMO is just one small facet of that, and I think most consumers are confused.
And that leads me to my next question. On both sides of this issue, what do we need to do a better job of? Janice?
Yeah, so for us at Monsanto, we have to admit, maybe we weren't always engaged in this conversation as much with sort of our local communities and stuff. You know, we're part of the farming community and we've done a good job, I hope, of talking to some of our farmers and things along that line. But for us, one of the big changes was for us to go, wait a minute, we need to be participating in this dialogue. We need to be out actively listening to people. We need to be out offering our perspective when people are interested. So I personally have been really engaged in that. We've done some things with the Aspen Ideas Festival. I personally got to go to South by Southwest Eco and have a conversation that I think Richard you'd probably find really interesting around the fact that we were talking about bee health and some of the things that are going on in bee health. And we had experts from around the country. One was a Monsanto expert, but kind of having this rich, robust conversation. So I think we need to do this kind of thing a lot more with a lot of diverse opinions in the room in order to help us all move forward.
Richard or Alan?
Well, I think for a very long time, us farmers have kind of taken advantage of the fact that society has given us a free pass. If you're doing it, it's got to be okay. And so we took advantage of that, and we need to be more transparent. We need to express our feelings and our beliefs and share the research that we have done and we have read and the decision-making process that goes into what we do. You know, my grandfather, my dad, and now I want to pass on to my son and my grandchildren. I mean, the farms are our most important asset, and we're not going to do anything to harm that. But conversely, the farm that I run today is so different than the one my great-grandfather had. But we're still doing the same thing. We're still raising our families. We're still doing what we need to do. And we just need to open up into the dialogue and have these discussions because, from every one of these, I learned something. And so I think that's what we need to do.
Richard?
I would like to see us move away from a chemical culture. We do a lot of stuff on our farm that requires no sprays at all, because we do a heavy crop rotation or we allow the ground to go fallow so that certain grubs or pests are, because we've put in mustards and a combination of mustards and tillage radishes or something like that, chemically, naturally, but it's still a chemical process, force those, bad nematodes in this case, out of where we want them. It means we have less production. I think looking at the price per bushel of corn right now, maybe a little bit less production of corn might be a little bit better. Farmers may reap the benefits of that and not have to use as many chemical amendments later on, because they're allowing some of their ground to go fallow. I think a lot of the issue actually kind of leads away from GMO and comes back to stewardship of the land and better management of the land. In some regions we had 4 feet of topsoil, now we have 4 inches, and that we're making headway in stemming that danger to our farmland. But I think we would be much better at doing that. And there's a lot of tools in the organic farmers toolkit that can be applied to conventional farmers. We have a lot of conventional farmers now that are using what we call groundhog radishes to loosen and till the soil without bringing steel into the soil. And it also increases nutrient quality. So I think the GMO issue is more of a consumer issue a lot of times than it is an actual farming issue, believe it or not.
Emily, what about from your perspective? What needs to happen as this discussion continues to move?
Well, first of all, thank you for having the discussion today. It really is good for everybody to get together and talk about the issues. And really to piggyback on some of what Richard just said, I think that, it's really important to talk about, a variety of different tools that organic and just sustainable farmers are using, so that we have a variety of approaches and that we can begin promoting more sustainable, more resilient systems that still protect the livelihood of farmers, because that is really critical.
I must say, I've been covering agriculture for a good many years and have seen this discussion take a lot of different directions over the years. But the one thing that I'm seeing more of is discussions like this with farmers who at one point, I'm not sure they would have been sitting in these chairs having this discussion, because we know what we're doing. We don't have to talk about it. I think, in my mind, that's one of the biggest changes. Alan, would you agree?
I would agree, yeah. 15 years ago, if someone would have asked to do this, I'd said, number one, why, and no.
Well, I think you guys mentioned it earlier. Richard was talking about food culture and sort of people's enthusiasm for food, and I think that's really shifted. I grew up in a world where we ate what my mom fed us, and we didn't have as much kind of discussions about food. But now, my 11-year-old nephew, he watches Food Network, he watches all these things, right? So when I go to Portland, Oregon, he expects me to bring something from Voodoo Donuts back or something, right? So we just live in a world where people are differently thoughtful and conscientious about food, and they really like different flavors and all those kind of things. And so I think that conversation has changed in a number of different ways. And for us, it's not just about farming. It's this melding of farming and food that have come together in a way that we just didn't have it when I was a kid or even when I was in college.
That's all the time we have for today. Our thanks to the panelists, and our thanks to you for watching.
This program is made possible thanks to the generous support from the Ohio Farm Bureau members, producing our food, growing our economy, and making communities stronger. The Ohio Farm Bureau, forging a partnership between farmers and consumers. And by
Nationwide's family of companies has a variety of products to protect your family, with our promise to be there when you need us, from city to farm. Nationwide is on your side.
Funding for Our Ohio is also made possible by the generous support from Turner Farm, a working organic farm and education center in Indian Hill, Ohio. And by your membership support to this public television station. Thank you.